Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we'll be drafting a transparent corset pattern with a structured sleeve, and in our next video we'll be sewing the corset pattern. So let's start. So I've marked my vertical measurement, which is my shoulder to bust, shoulder to under bust, shoulder to waist, and the top length. So for an ordinary transparent corset, you can use your shoulder to waist plus your joining allowance, but for an inbuilt corset you're going to use 22 inches to 26 depending on the height of the person. So the next thing I'll do is to mark my neckline, and I'm using the standard neckline, which is 3 by 3 inches. After marking that, I'm going to place my French curve and I'm going to draw out the neckline. After that, the next thing is to mark your shoulder divided by 2. So my shoulder is 14 divided by 2. I have 7 inches. So I'm going to mark 7 inches as at the starting line as my shoulder. So at that shoulder point, I'm going to place my tape and I'm going to go down by 1 inch. So for that 1 inch is going to serve as my shoulder slant. So what I'm going to do right now is to place my place my ruler, and I'm going to draw my shoulder slant. After drawing it out with my pencil, I'm going to draw it out with my marker so that it will be visible. Next thing we are going to do is to find the chest line. So the next thing you're going to do is to divide your bust by 6 plus 1.5 inches. So to do that, I have 7 inches and I'm going to mark. So at that 7 inches line, I'm just going to make sure I have a straight line and I'm going to rule. So after doing that, I'm going to place my ruler back and I'm going to draw out my chest line. After drawing out my chest line, I'm going to divide what I have at that point into 2, which is 3.5, and from that point I'm going to go in by ½ inch. At that ½ inch point, I'm going to place my French curve, connect it to my shoulder and connect it to my chest line. But before I do that, I'm going to place my bust measurement at my chest line to avoid my armhole exceeding my bust line. So I'll go back and I'll place my French curve to draw my armhole curve. So after marking my armhole curve, the next thing is to mark my dart intake. And to mark your dart intake is your bust span, or nipple to nipple divided by 2. So I'm going to mark that at my bust line. Go ahead to mark it at my chest line. I'll mark it at the under bust. Then I'll mark it at my waistline and also go down to my top length, and I'm going to mark it. So after marking that, I'm going to place my ruler and I'm going to draw a straight line connecting from my chest line to my bust line to my under bust to my waist and down to my top length. So next, whatever I have at my shoulder, I'm going to divide it by 2. So I have 4.2 inches, and dividing it by 2, I have 2.1. Then I'm going to connect it down to my chest, the dart line at my chest line. So the next thing I'm going to do is to mark my dart intake. So at the under bust, I'm going to mark 1 inch at both sides for my dart intake. Then going to the waistline, I'm going to mark 1 inch at both sides for my dart intake. So for this particular corset pattern, I'm going to be making use of a diamond dart. You can as well go down and mark 1 inch if you like. So next, I'm just going to place my ruler and I'm going to connect the line from my under bust down to my waist, and I'm going to place it and connect it down to my top length. So I'll also repeat the same thing for the other side of my corset. Next step is to draw my cup, and I'm going to place my French cup touching the bust line and touching the under bust. So I'll go ahead to draw my curve. So if you don't have a French curve, you can make use of a freehand sketch. So after doing that, I'll also draw the cup for the other side. touching the bust and also touching my under bust, and I'm going to draw. Next step I'll be taking is to determine how deep you want your neckline to be. So I'm just going to go down by 1.5 inches, although later I extended it back to 1 inch. So after marking that 1.5 inches, from there I'm going to determine the type of neckline that you want for your corset. So what I'm going to do is to place my tape, and I'll mark 1.5 inches from my chest line. So if you want it to cover very well on top, you can go ahead to mark 2 inches. So I'm just going to make use of 1.5 inches. So at that point that I marked, I'm going to connect it. I'm going to draw a rough sketch connecting it down to the neckline to check if it's what I want. So after doing that, I'll go ahead to use my French curve to outline the design or the neckline. So after drawing the neckline, the next thing I'm going to do is to draw the cup area. So I'm just going to place my French curve this way, and I'm going to draw the cup underneath it. So you can also use a freehand sketch to also do this. So this is what I have at this point. Then the next thing is to draw my cup for the other side. So to do that, I'll make sure I have my bust measurement divided by 4 at my bust point, and I'm going to go ahead to mark it. So whatever I have between my armhole and my bust circumference divided by 4, I'm going to divide it into 2. So after dividing it, I'll go ahead to mark. So from there, I'll be drawing my neckline for the corsets on top. So from there, I went ahead to readjust the neckline back to 1 inch, just like I said earlier, because I was thinking it was too deep. After readjusting my neckline, I'm going to draw my cup for this part. So what I'm going to do is to place my French curve and connect it from that mark I came in with. So you can as well use a freehand sketch to also do this. After doing this, the next step I'm going to take is to mark my dart intake, and I'm going to mark 1 inch at both sides. After marking that 1 inch, I'm going to connect it down to my bust line to draw my darts for that part. So for the other part also, I'm going to place my French curve, and I'm going to connect from my 1 inch darts down to the bust line. So after doing this, what I'm going to do next is to outline my corset. After outlining my corset, I'll go ahead to shade out my dart areas. After outlining my corset, I'm going to place my tape to mark my bust circumference. So to mark that is your bust divided by 4, and I'm going to mark. So I'll go ahead to measure these darts I have on top, or you can just go ahead to measure the dart at your chest line. So after measuring that, I'm just going to place it and mark back. So after marking that, I'll go ahead to mark ½ inch. So for this corset pattern, I won't be sewing with much allowance. So I'll extend what I have at my chest line back to my bust line. Then at my under bust, I'm going to mark my under bust circumference divided by 4. After marking that, I'll go ahead to mark my dart intake I have at that point. Then after marking the dart intake, I'm going to mark half. So the reason why we are replacing the dart intake is because we are going to actually cut it off from the pattern. Next, I'm going to mark my waist circumference divided by 4, and I will mark my dart intake. Then go ahead to mark my ½ inch sewing allowance. Going down to my hip, I'm going to mark my hip circumference divided by 4. Then I'm going to just mark ½ inch in case I have any reduction at my hip, and then I'll go back and mark my half-inch sewing allowance. So if you want to snatch your corset pattern, you can go ahead to do that. So after doing this, I'll go ahead to connect the line back from my chest line to my bust, to my under bust, to my waist, and down to my hip line. So to give my corset a little curve, I'm going to go down and measure 1.5 inches from downwards, and I'm going to connect it back to my corset pattern. Then from now, I'm just going to go ahead to cut out my pattern. But before I do that, I'm going to number my cup sides and the body of my corset, and I'll go ahead to draft the back part of my corset before cutting it out. So next thing you're going to check is to make sure your cup part aligns. So this is very important, especially when you're joining or sewing your corset. So to do that, you're just going to blend your drafting paper this way. So you're going to check if it meets. If it doesn't, you're just going to go ahead to blend your line. So after blending in your line, your corset for the front part is ready. So after that, the next thing I'm going to do is to cut out my corset pattern for the front. And please stick to the end of the video to see how to draft the back pattern of this corset. So after cutting out the front pattern of this corset, this is what I have. So we'll go over to draft the back pattern. So to draft the back pattern, I'm going to make use of the remaining pattern paper I have for the front, and I've gone ahead to mark my basic neckline, which is 3 by 1 inch. Just like I did for my front pattern, I drew my shoulder slant and my armhole. So if you watched the beginning of the pattern, you will see where I did this. So I'll go ahead to just write out my shoulder to bust, shoulder to under bust, waistline, and top length of my pattern. So I use the same length for the front, and you'll notice this pattern does not have a zipper allowance because we will not be making use of a zip for this corset. So the next thing I'll do is to mark my dart for the back, and to mark my dart for the back, I'm going to place my tape and I'm going to mark my shoulder to bust plus 1 inch, which leaves me here. So from that point, I'm going to mark my nipple to nipple measurement divided by 2, or my bust span, which gives me 3.5. So I'm going to mark it at my under bust, at my waistline. Then I'll also extend it down to my top length. So just like I said, your top length can be your shoulder to waist plus your joining allowance, but for an inbuilt corset, you're going to use from 22 inches down to 26 depending on your length, on your height. So next thing I'm going to do is to connect all those lines, and I'm going to draw a straight line. So after drawing this straight line, the next thing I'm going to mark is my dart intake, and I'm going to mark 1/2 inch at both sides of that line. From that point, I'm going to join it back to that point on top. So while joining it, I'm going to use my marker to do that so that it will be very visible for you to see the marking on the pattern paper. So the next step I'm going to take is to insert my body circumference. At my bust, I'm going to mark my bust circumference divided by 4 inches, and I'm going to mark. After marking that, I'll go ahead to mark my 1/2 inch for sewing allowance. So remember, on this pattern we are not using much allowance. Whatever I have at my bust, I'm going to extend at my chest line. Going down to my under bust circumference, I'm going to mark my under bust circumference. After marking that, I'm going to mark this dart intake I have here, and I'm going to replace it. After replacing it, I'll go ahead to mark 1/2 inch for joining or sewing allowance. Coming down to my waistline, I'm going to mark my waist circumference divided by 4, and I'm going to measure the dart intake I have there. I'm also going to replace it at this point, and then go ahead to mark ½ inch for joining or sewing allowance. Then going down to my waist, I'm going to mark my waist circumference divided by 4. Then after marking that, I'm going to go back to measure the dart intake I have at this point. So after measuring the dart intake, I'm going to replace it on my pattern. Then after replacing it, I'll go ahead to add ½ inch for sewing allowance. So after doing that, what I'm going to do is to connect from my chest line down to my under bust to my waist and down to my hip line. So you can go ahead to use your French curve to do this, or you can just go ahead to use a freehand sketch just the way I'm doing. So after marking this out, I'll just go ahead to use my marker to outline it so that the mark will be very visible for you to see. Then I'll go ahead, place my tape, and I'll mark 1.5 inch just like the way I did for the front, just to create a curve by the side. So for my back pattern, I don't really want to have a very deep curve, so I'll just take it down a little and I'm going to draw. So I'm done with this part of the corset. Next step is to determine where my yoke will start, and to make this easy, I want my yoke to just start where my chest line is. So I'm just going to outline my chest area. Sorry that I made a mistake and it's not a bit straight while outlining it. So I'm going to connect from my neckline down to that part. But before I do this, I'm going to be marking the part for my lacing bar. So you can go ahead to go in by 2 inches, 3 inches, but I don't want to have much gaping or space at the back of my corset, so I'm just going to make use of 1.5 inches. So I'll go ahead to mark this all the way down. So after marking it, what I'm going to do is to place my tape, my ruler, and I'm going to connect it, drawing a straight line. So after doing that, I'll go ahead to make little marks at the back to indicate that this is the part for my lacing bar. And I'll also mark out the parts that I won't be working with. So the next thing from here is to determine the neckline. So I'll just go ahead to connect it from that point down to where my lacing bar ended, or where my lacing bar ends. So if you notice, my back pattern is usually very easy and simple. So after doing that, I'll go ahead to mark this part as my yoke area, and I'll go ahead to outline the other parts of my corset. And after doing this, I'll go ahead to cut out my pattern for the back. So but before I do that, you can go ahead to extend whatever you have at this dart line in case you want to cut it into two. But for my pattern, I'm going to go ahead to blend in this dart intake this way. I'm not going to cut it out. I'll just blend it and just cut out one pattern for my back. So the next thing is to cut out my corset pattern for the back. So at this point, if you find this tutorial very interesting and educative, please don't forget to hit on the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and also turn on your notification button to get new updates from my channel whenever I post new videos. And this is the corset pattern for both the front and the back. So in the next video, we'll be sewing this.